This next book I have to review for everyone is the last book that Tony Judt wrote before he passed away from ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, a few years ago. It's called Ill Fares the Land, and I'll just read the quote that's perhaps too small for you to read in the middle there. It's a quote from Oliver Goldsmith's poem, Ill Fares the Land, from 1770. It reads, or two lines from it read, "Ill fares the land to hastening ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay." This is a pretty fascinating book, and gives really, I mean, he gets, if you know Judd, he was not afraid to get his hands politically dirty with his own opinions, and he certainly issues a lot of his own political opinions here. But for someone who's pretty, I guess, classically considered a liberal, he does make some pretty interesting criticisms in this book, which I'll talk about here. It's very often been said, of course, that Americans know the value of everything and the worth of nothing. And this book, I think, largely serves to historicize why precisely that is the case, and also serves as a clarion call extolling the virtues of a social democracy. What he calls social democracy, I think what is probably what many other people call democratic socialism. So if I use those terms interchangeably, forgive me. When I use them, I mean them to be the same thing. According to Judd, we need to completely rethink how we view our neighbors and how we view the human community around social democracy. Social democracy, as I said, is at the heart of the book, and Judd makes it quite clear that this isn't just a generic term for a liberal or for liberalism. Quote, "They, social democrats, share with liberals a commitment to cultural and religious tolerance, but in public policy, social democrats believe in the possibility and virtue of collective action for the collective good. Like most liberals, social democrats favor progressive taxation in order to pay for public services and other social goods that individuals cannot provide themselves. But whereas many liberals might see such taxation or public provision as a necessary evil, a social democratic vision for the good society entails from the outset a greater role for the state and the public sector." End quote. Note the terms collective good and collective action. They're really at the center of reimagining society in terms of something other than increasing market share or a growing economy, or what can individuals do to do these things. There's really some sense of collective good and action and collective behavior at the heart of what democratic socialism is all about. Judd offers a lot of evidence toward the beginning of the book showing how inequality, which is not to be mistaken for wealth, by the way, but actual inequality in society, that is, a lot of people having not much money at all, and a few people having a vast majority of it. How inequality within a society is directly correlated with a lot of really bad things that we want to prevent, like, and this list is from page 18, infant mortality, life expectancy, criminality, the prison population, mental illness, unemployment, obesity and malnutrition, teenage pregnancy, illegal drug use, economic insecurity, personal indebtedness, and anxiety. But matters didn't always look so bleak, according to him. After the Great Depression, and World War II, it quickly became the consensus economic position that the state had an integral role to play in keeping events like these, like the Great Depression and like World War II, from ever happening again. Judt is especially interested in the arguments and the contributions of John Maynard Keynes here. And the trust and the cooperation of the interventionist state, which is largely the work of Keynes, provided England and the United States with security, prosperity, social services, and greater equality. For a generation, no one questioned that these ends were also public goods, or if they were questioned by the more marginal figures in the political world. Figures that really didn't have any political power to speak of. So, what happened? Ironically, Judt lays much of the blame for this disintegration of the welfare state on the radical political movement of the 1960s, which he claims rejected the inherited collectivism of its predecessor. Christopher Lasch, by the way, similarly claims that this set of movements did the exact same thing in his book, The Culture of Narcissism, which I just posted about a week ago on this channel. By the way, The Culture of Narcissism is a book that sort of beautifully and subtly complements Ill Fares the Land. If you're interested in reading either one, certainly read the other. They have a lot of light to shed on one another. Judt argues that social justice wasn't central to the mission of liberal 60s activism, or I guess what I should call radical 60s activism, as to sort of unmoor it from liberalism par excellence. In fact, it even co-opted the rhetoric of fierce individualism, which we more associate with conservatism and libertarianism. It was all about doing your own thing, right, and letting it all hang out, and sort of sectioning yourself off from society instead of making yourself a part of it. This consequently, he argues, left a vacuum into which Austrian economics could rush. People like Karl Popper, Ludwig von Mises, Joseph Schumpeter, Peter Drucker, Friedrich Hayek. These men, all Austrians, were all profoundly influenced by what Judt calls the introduction into post-1918 Austria state-directed planning, municipally owned services, and collectivized economic activity. They just they didn't like it. They saw it in Austria when they were very, very young, in their formative years, getting their college educations, and they thought it was horrible. Of course, this attempt to do this in Austria, right around the time of World War I, was a failure which seemed to leave a sort of gigantic psychic wound on all of these thinkers and their future thought about the possibility of state interventionism or even short-term economic planning. Also, these men knew that a left that believed in human reason and historical material laws, Marxist laws, that's what the left believed in, where the fascists believed in action. They had an aesthetic of, well, violence, obviously, very often, but the futurists, closely allied with, well, certainly fascists. The futurists especially had an aesthetic of action, of doing something, not letting historical laws and materialism just sort of break its way through history, but of actually doing something yourself and affecting history in a more immediate, aggressive way. And Judt therefore reminds us that most, through this introduction of these five people who were, to some degree or another affiliated with Austrian economics, what would later be sort of called the Chicago School of Economics, reminds us that these contemporary recapitulations that we have of this debate are really just variations on a theme that's about 100 years old. The prominence of Austrian economics and neoliberal policies allowed for the ascendancy of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, whose respective reigns saw a liquidation of much of the public sector in their respective countries during the 1980s. For Judt, these massive efforts at privatization were largely responsible for a loss of community and communal trust. We now live in our gated communities with closed-circuit cameras, terrified of our neighbors, ruled by feckless, soulless politicians like Bill and Hillary Clinton. Yes, someone has to say it, so I know you're not around to hear it anymore, Tony Judt, but thank you. As well as people like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. With people like these, it's really not a small wonder why we're so cynical about politicians and political efficacy anymore. Judt ends the book with a call for both a renewed fervor for political dissent, which he sees as essential for democracy and especially for social democracy, and a recasting of public conversation. Intellectuals used to be respected for broadcasting their unpopular opinions, but today that ability too seems to be innervated. Through a sheer act of moral will, we have to learn how to rediscover how to think these things through and how to express issues of disapproval in a country that has historically been incredibly conformist. And I'm talking about the United States. He discusses England to a much lesser degree, I think, in the book, but when he's talking about conformity, he's certainly talking about the United States. And to this end, he suggests that we need to think the state and think the community in radically different ways, which means brushing away old shibboleths like, we all want the same thing, we just disagree on how to get there, or you either believe in freedom or tyranny, or capitalism or communism. These are slogans. These are so totally inculcated into popular political thinking and the gruel offered up by media pundits. And they should be recognized for what they are, he says, simplistic and reductive, aimed at making one think that there are no middle ways, no third or fourth or fifth options. But old habits are hard to slough off. When you look at the media, you certainly see that, I think, in the United States. Acts of pure imagination and appropriating the political world anew are very, very difficult. But at least, according to Tony Judt, now is the time. The last book of Tony Judt, his swan song, Ill Fares the Land.